pandemic and the challenges and opportunities that the sudden move to using digital technology brought to them, as well as their hopes and worries relating to our digital futures. So, and while of course these organizations actually organized in pretty remarkable ways to respond to the crisis, unsurprisingly unequal digital access in terms of skills, access to hardware, data or patchy internet connections for both providers and beneficiaries was a really significant issue. And this was, of course, also exacerbated by the sudden lack of the social connections, care, and solidarity that play such an important role in enabling digital access in community centers or various spaces of congregation. So, in a nutshell, it's a bit more complicated, but the sudden move to using digital meant that many beneficiaries disappeared altogether, while new people began using particular services because of the digital offer. And here, the people that we spoke to told us about concerns relating to digital well-being and how to ensure the safety and security of both service providers and service users. So, of course, the impact of the digitalization of services and the digitalization of services per se, it's not a new project, but the experience of the pandemic brought a renewed sense of the importance, the critical importance to realize digital access that works for everyone. But a digital access that works for people perhaps needs to be understood as something that is necessarily co-created in ways that respond to the particularities of people's needs, their circumstances, and that safeguards them. So today's session aims to offer a discussion around ways which we can conceive of democratizing digital access and work together and with people across institutions and organizations to create the conditions that can enable adapting, contesting, and shaping our digital future so that people can benefit from them. So I'm now going to introduce our lovely three panelists who are joining us for the session and who will share their perspectives and experiences on this topic. So with us today, we have Lizzie Coles-Kemp, who is a qualitative researcher at the Royal Holloway, University of London. Lizzie uses creative engagement methods to explore everyday practices of information sharing and protection. She's also currently an EPSRC Research Fellow with a research program in everyday security and digital service design. Lizzie is also one of our co-investigators for the Not Equal project. With us today also we have Legaspi, who is a community organizer in Citizens UK, where he develops social justice campaigns on various issues. Froilan is also a partner in the Not Equal funded project, Civic Innovation in Community, Safety, Policing and Trust with Young People, where they explore technologies and knife crimes in collaboration with young people in order to understand the complexities of these issues and develop a platform for young people's voices to influence a public health approach to the problem. And finally, James Nicholson, who is a lecturer in the School of Computer and Information Sciences at Northumbria University. James is interested in many aspects of cybersecurity and privacy, including usable and inclusive security, people's understanding of cybersecurity and everyday surveillance. James is also leading on a Not Equal funded project, Cyber Guardians, where they are exploring ways to support older digital users in becoming cybersecurity guardians for their local community and organically train other older adults in this practice. Okay, I'm done now with all the introductions. Thank you again all for being here, and I'd like to hand over to Lizzie, who is going to talk for the next 5 minutes. Thank you. You are probably still muted, Lizzie.
Yeah, I lost my toolbar somewhere. All right, okay. So thank you. Let's get going. So thank you for that introduction. Can you see my screen? Yeah, awesome. Okay, so I just want to set out the digital security for all position that Not Equal has had now for the last couple of years. And it's really great to have the other two panelists because they're working with projects that actually are related to that theme. I want to use 4 images that have been drawn by Alice Angus to talk about some of the principles that we bring in here and why we're arguing for a more inclusive digital security and what that means in practice. So the first observation that I think I'd like to make here is that designing systems where we're trying to design people for systems rather than systems for people has been a constant theme of many of the areas that we work in. This frustration that the computer says no, that the computer decides or determines what we can do, has right from the start in Not Equal been a constant theme from the groups that we work with. And what I want to point out is that this is really one of the core problems for democratizing access. Before we get to the technology, what the problem that we have is that those technologies signify values, goals that don't resonate with many of the groups that we work with. And we have to go back to those principles. We have to examine the goals and the values before we layer technology on top of that. That means that the approaches we have to recognize that value proposition and help us to realize the implications that has for what we design. And we really shouldn't be that surprised if people don't engage with the access control that we provide, if they don't buy into the goals of the system. The next position that I want to outline is also related to that, is that the logic for access also has to be fair, has to be just. Before we get to the technologies, the basis on which we grant access and the basis on which we deny access has to be clear, has to be transparent, and has to be accountable. And in the pandemic that we find ourselves in, people are catapulted into having to use digital services that the basis on which access, they have no face-to-face means anymore of questioning the basis on which they get access, on understanding the logic on which they get access. And they're being presented increasingly with online versions of systems without that transparency. So another thing that we have to tackle before we get to the technology is the underpinning logic, and to think through the logic, and also to think through the implications, identify and think through the implications of exclusion. Intended exclusion, but also unintended exclusion. Exclusion through the way we design the technologies, exclusion through the way that we frame and deliver the technologies, exclusion through the way that the service is meant to work, and understand the harms that causes and the implications that has for a cohesive digital society. Thirdly, I'd like to highlight the fact that when we think about access control, a lot of the access doesn't actually happen when you hit the keyboard, you enter your username and password. So much of that happens in our background networks and in the ways that we relate to each other within our social environments. As this picture shows, you have people helping you, thinking, explaining to you how services work. You explain to others how they work. The whole series of capabilities and skills that need to be in place in order for you to gain access and meaningfully use the technology and gain benefit from it. And I don't think that we think enough about that. We've got 2 great examples in the next panelists of people who do work in that space, but this is still not a mainstream activity. It's often handed off to third sector or civil society to help or pick up those pieces, or even our kin and friendship networks. So putting a much bigger spotlight onto that is going to be an important way forward to understand who has access to what networks, who has access to what support, and democratizing access to that support. But also I think for my own community, which is a technological security community, understanding the importance of that backdrop. And when we think about analysing the security of a service and what that offers, how that benefits people, pull that into our scope of analysis. And finally, when we think about these processes, often the way that we think about access, conceptualize access, is done from quite a narrow expert perspective, or people who are regarded as experts in that area. We don't think about the access issues. We tend not to cover in the mainstream. We don't, as routine, cover access issues, think about access issues and access benefits from the perspectives of the groups that are using it. We assume that access by default is just having the technology or having the internet connection, and it's much, much wider than that. But in the COVID era, in the era of not only social distancing, but reduced access to resources, which is going to unfold even further sort of over the next few months and years, we've also got to think about how we do that democratic engagement. Face-to-face might not be an option. We might need to scale it in a different way. And I think that there's a large amount of focus and collaboration that needs to go into finding new ways to bring people together, to identify what those issues are and agree on those issues and what we need to attend to first in the case of access. So thank you. That was my piece.
Thank you very much, Lizzie. I think we'll go straight into the next 5 minutes. I wonder if Froy, I cannot see you. Ah, yes, I can.
I am here.
To go next. Thank
Great.
you.
I can do that.
Thank you, Lizzie.
Hopefully people can see my screen. Great. So hi everyone, my name is Froy and I'm a community organizer with Citizens UK. And I work with about 25 different civil society organizations in the London boroughs of Hackney and Islington. So mostly schools, some faith groups and some community groups. I remember when I first got my computer, it was in 1996, must have been about 10. And, you know, I think it was a massive investment on my mother's part. Single parent, work as a nurse for the NHS. And I just remember how transformative that experience, having access to technology was for me, both in terms of, you know, resources to my education. If everyone remembers in Carter, I remember using that a lot for my homework. And it's clear now that access to technology is like really critical, not just for an individual basis and social basis, but for community groups as well. And in face of lockdown, social distancing, this pandemic, life for our community groups have been dramatically transformed to the point where some of them are in near crisis. And I just want to quickly outline some of the work that we're doing with them post COVID-19. So on the screen, you see the 5 steps of social change, which is kind of like our kind of strategic art when we think about community organizing as a practice to as a form of participatory action research, but also kind of how do we take that research and basically lead it towards concrete, discrete political change, i.e. policy, innovation, adoption, etc. So step 1 is we organize. And so I already work with a diverse alliance of about 25 groups. Each of those organizations pay money into the pot. And what that means is that there's a large body of people and community leaders who are literally bought into a vehicle. And those community leaders have a wide range of existing relationships within their communities and individuals around, and they tend to be diverse. So in London, 50% are in the 30% of our membership and 30% poorest areas in the UK. The second step is that we listen. So in late April, we brought together 29 community leaders from 16 community organizations across the areas I work with. The 2 main issues was 1, mental health, and 2nd, digital inclusion. And we set out to what do we mean by that? And so we had another kind of workshops. And really what we meant by digital inclusion was access to technology and internet. 2nd, which was skills. So for example, elderly congregations didn't know how to use access the technology in order to be able to engage with services online. But thirdly, and this is what my focus on the rest of my the conversation will be, on how communities are adapting and delivering new forms of digital services and other services that comply with social distancing legislation. And, you know, when I speak to, you know, priests, teachers, educators, it always felt like they were just like trying to cope, like an emergency kind of cope and transition in a relatively short amount of time to a new normal. And I think for those community leaders, there's always a feeling that this is just not good enough. This is not the same as what they deliver. And it was really interesting when I kind of posed the question to them. Do you realize you're innovators right now? You're innovating new forms of digital services that didn't really exist before. So talking to some teachers who teach ESOL students, adults learning English as a second language. They're developing all these creative ways to think about how can I deliver these classes, but via digital context, but make it interesting, because as we all know, when in front of Zoom for so long, it can get a little bit boring after a little while. But all these people were trying to innovate, but without access to expertise or knowledge or frameworks. Like, how do you do this properly? And when I look at government and the private sector, resources like serve designers, ways of looking at innovation, how do we look at the service we're delivering in new and innovative ways that meets the needs of our people, but kind of embraces the reality that we're in? Civil society doesn't have access to this. And so we are about to kind of launch a workshop soon where we hope to plan, what do we mean by supporting civil society through this? One potential aspect, which has come in conversation and it still needs to be ratified, is campaigning for pro bono kind of hours consultancy from serve designers, where we work near Shoreditch, a lot of those type of organizations there. And so what I'm hoping for is that we can secure and deliver support for community leaders who are, you know, have done really well in the short term, but I think to medium to long term will continue to face an existential crisis until they get the support that they need to deliver the service on the ground. I remember speaking with an assistant priest at a church I work with, who says just being assigned to restart and look at the mothers and babies group. And she said, Froy, how on earth do I do a mothers and babies group when we can't meet in person? And to the lives and the meaning of those mothers who might be isolated, who might be vulnerable, that's a really, really important question to answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Froy. Thank you. We'll move on now to James, who will offer some more thoughts on this.
Thank you. I don't have slides, so feel free to put something nicer instead of looking at my face while I talk. I'll just start off with some background on what my project is, the Cyber Guardians project, as what we're doing kind of leads on from that. So one of the biggest problems that citizens have with cybersecurity is that they're not always sure how to protect themselves, and they don't always know where to go or who to go to get that information from. And this happens to be particularly true for older users who don't always have access to knowledgeable sources. So with that in mind, we set out to train older members of the community to become cyber guardians and disseminate cybersecurity best practices throughout their communities. So we did this through 3 training sessions, where essentially we used interactive demonstrations, videos, activities, plenty of discussion. And after 9 hours of training, the cyber guardians were encouraged to go and spread the information to their peers. This was done over a month, not over a week, just for context. So obviously with COVID hitting, one of the biggest issues that older users faced was that they were forced to go online and embrace online technology all of a sudden, even more regularly than they would regularly do, or maybe even for the first time. So all of a sudden, they had to try and get online shopping, potentially use Zoom, and they weren't really prepared for this. They're not always aware of key cybersecurity threats. They know that there are threats, but these are not always concrete, which can lead to a lot of anxiety and actually not engaging with these systems. But of course, at this point, they were forced to engage with these systems. So what we did, our guardians were trained by that point. One of the things that they saw as useful was running Zoom sessions for their peers, so they would know how to use Zoom securely and to alleviate some of the anxieties around Zoom. Obviously, at this time, one of the key things on the news was Zoom bombings and Zoom being insecure and people shouldn't use Zoom. So what they did, well, what we did together, we developed sessions, we developed materials so that they could then go on and talk to their peers about how to use it securely, what settings to look out for specifically, what not to do, again, cyber hygiene tactics. And they have gone on to deliver these sessions to peers, usually in groups. They started off with small groups, usually people that they knew, in order to build their confidence. Of course, running sessions like these can be quite frightening if you're not used to it, can be quite frightening if you're not used to the technology. So they have built their confidence over the past few weeks, actually, to the point where they're now delivering sessions to completely unknown people. And one of the very interesting things that has come out of this is that they've used these Zoom sessions, how to use Zoom comfortably, securely, in order to sell, if you like, their cybersecurity sessions. So once they're done with the Zoom sessions, they advertise, right, so we've got sessions on how to manage your passwords properly, key advice, simple things you can do, how to look out for scams, what sort of software do you need on your computer, which again improves the access and the security for older users who again aren't necessarily aware of these key things that they can do. The feedback so far has been pretty amazing, actually. We've had many participants email their appreciation to the Cyber Guardians. We've got tales about how they now manage to speak with, see critically, family of the other side of the world, family that are just down the road, but they can't actually see face to face. And of course, the fact that they've gone to these sessions, the fact that they are now engaging more online, has led to them coming to our security specific sessions so they can be even more confident when using the internet day to day for whether it's shopping, whether it's communications or anything else. I think that's probably my 5 minutes actually, but I'm happy to answer any questions on this around the challenges we've had, which are numerous, or anything else.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much, James. So we've kept all the 5 minutes talks at the start, and thank you, Jack, for clapping your hands. Yes, we shall all do that. And so maybe a few people have raised their hands, but we wanted to keep all the questions for the end. So if anybody got any question or a comment to initiate the discussion, now is the moment. Okay. Otherwise, I can't see everyone, but okay. So I'll just use one of my reserve questions. So there seemed to be an important component to access, which relates to well-being, care, and a sort of social and affective dimension that seem to be part of enabling access for those who maybe are not familiar with digital or try to learn, or they are simply looking to access a service. And these also play an important role in making it an enjoyable and beneficial experience. So I wonder if you could offer some thoughts of ways in which we might foreground these values in the tools and processes we might design in the future, or perhaps in the ways that you've already done in some of the work that you've been talking about.
So I think from a access design perspective, we need to foreground the relational processes rather than just focus on access as a transaction of getting in or out of the system. And that poses some fairly fundamental challenges, as Freud pointed out, because most of that relational work has historically been done face-to-face. And the other key challenge here that we're picking up from working with groups in the not equal network is keeping that relational process, working with people who are very vulnerable and who are on the edges of networks. And so these are two areas where I think as a community, we need to crowdsource and think about the different possibilities, learn from and really be an active participant in the innovations that Freud is talking about, and also thinking about how we can support cyber guardians who are also sort of really developing a relational role out there. But it does need some careful thought, because always we've defaulted back to face-to-face, and we've defaulted back to place-based working on this. And I think that this is really an area that needs some collective thought.
Okay, thank you, Lizzie. I think we've got a couple of questions, actually. I don't know if Roy or James or anybody else in the virtual room would like to add anything to this.
I mean, yeah, just to expand on Lizzie's point, I mean, I'm thinking one church I work with in particularly comes to mind. So it's based in Hackney. Most of the congregation are quite elderly and come from and they're black, mostly black congregations, and who are kind of figures are very susceptible or have been most impacted by the effects of coronavirus and COVID-19. And so speaking to this church leader, and he was just really, really concerned. I mean, like, they've been trying their best to contact using snail mail, paying a small fortune for stamps. Gosh, I don't remember the last time I bought a stamp. But it's proving like a serious existential threat for that community and for that community group. How do you maintain relationships with people who have to shield and isolate? How do you support them to even get online? And I think we have to think about, I think the conversation about access and technology kind of almost like lends itself to kind of like a neoliberal approach that, oh, we just need to give them internet, give them access. Whereas I think, when I think about my elderly auntie, I think without me and my sister supporting, she doesn't have any other family, me and my sister, that's it. And we provide, we are effect her digital guardians in a way, making sure that she gets her services, her prescription delivered, and without trusted people and relationships and communities and families, it just doesn't work. Now, the key question is it even possible to do that in the current status we have in? I mean, one reflection I'm kind of considering is maybe digital technology is very useful for maintaining existing relationships, but is it possible to build new relationships, trusted relationships via this medium? I'm not so sure. But these are the kind of questions that, myself and the community leaders that I'm working with are wrestling as they're preparing that this might be, I mean, some of the churches I'm talking to and the community, some groups said we won't convene until there's a vaccine, and that might be 2 years. And what will happen to that community group after those 2 years? Will the people think, well, I've survived this long without them for 2 years, maybe I won't go back, and that would be a big, big shame for the local community and society as a whole.
Okay, thank you, Froy. We have a few questions, so we'll might ask people to ask them themselves if they want. So a question from Pam. Pam, do you want to come in?
Yeah, so I was just asking a question. There's been some amazing innovation. I mean, Zoom's an example of something that has really been picked up a lot. And of course, at the moment, you know, they're busy working on some of the problems that they've had, but it's still a new tool that's free for people to use without some of the associated disadvantages of free tools, you know, all the advertising type things, etc. But I'm just wondering, there's lots of examples where people have done things free during the lockdown. You know, free concerts, all sorts, just loads. You'll have all experienced some of them. I'm wondering, with my sort of cynical on how long this could go on, and whether we think there's ways to try and sustain those advantages now that we've got. Particularly, you know, so not everyone, as you say, will have access in the future, but for the moment it seems that there's a little, yeah, there are digital barriers, but at the same time, say finance seems less of a barrier at the moment than it maybe would be in the future.
I think just one thing about Zoom that I think is yes, it's free on the one hand, but it consumes a large amount of bandwidth on the other. So one of the other issues, I don't know if Froi's come across this, but we're coming across groups who just can't afford to access Zoom, who don't have that level of access. And I think so there are many that sort of tangentially to your point, Pam, but I just wanted to raise that because this is throwing up again sort of the need to look at digital access as a right, not as a privilege, and not just thin access, but access that can hold these types of interactions and engagements. And so I think it opens up another dimension to this problem. But there's probably other people who can talk about the economies and the markets for this sort of access better than I can.
I think it does create an interesting, you know, kind of question about what cost is. I mean, I think, you know, it's easy to start to see something, to imagine it's low cost, but you raise a very good point about the way that the hidden costs are there, and the hidden costs of, you know, for people with low digital literacy to get up to speed, etc. But it is interesting to try and document the kind of costs for different groups and communities, individuals, to get up to that kind of level and take advantage of something when it seems like it's a, you know, sort of great time for grabbing hold of some of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. There are a few more questions, so we might as well go through them. Abdullahi, I think, oh no, maybe it wasn't a question. I think we had a question from Alex. Do you want to?
Thanks, Clara. Hopefully you can hear me. I feel like I'm stating the obvious here, because I know so many of you have worked with communities for many years, and but it's that collective work of access that interests me. And you know, Freud speaks to this in terms of churches, you know, that there are these actors, whether they be individuals or groups, that just seem so critical to maintaining community cohesion and in this case even access, that so much is invested in that. And I just don't know if we're taking that seriously in the technologies we build. I don't, maybe there are examples in which we are. I think Alan was involved in some work in Lancaster in that regard, in terms of community and digital infrastructures. He's pretending he doesn't know anything about it, but you know, I think that feels like something that's amiss here, maybe, that we're invested in putting in the networks and the fiber, but how do we invest in maintaining the infrastructures of community? And you know, I know everyone here is on board with that, so I'm preaching to the converted.
Yeah, I guess the question is on how. So perhaps, you know, there are different ideas or
yeah, what do those technologies look like. And yeah, the project that I think Alan worked on was something simple, which was a notice board in a rural village, a digital notice board. But there must be more than that. What I love about the Not Equal project is it's so practical. It really is about these issues and how you sort of make them real. And that's what's coming up in these discussions. But it's, how can we move from just thinking about the fiber networks to these much more collective human infrastructures?
I guess for me, my big reflection is, for many years now, the discussion of civil society, charities, to digitize has been immense. It's had profound effect on the market and profound effect on public services. Like, I have my GP appointments online now, which is fascinating. And I think there's always a natural skepticism from people whose kind of core values are about the face-to-face and in person. And I think what this pandemic and lockdown presents is an opportunity to kind of shift that. And I think if you introduce a frame about, government have got their COVID-19 response sorted out, well, on paper at least. Companies certainly do. And I guess there's a challenge towards community groups. So what is your post-COVID-19 plan? And I think there's definitely inequality in how some groups are responding. So some groups, they have elements where there's more affluence in their community. The community leaders, very online, very tech savvy, and they're already talking about hybrid services. So one organization I work with, they're thinking about, well, maybe with the youth group, we can do like one in-person session 1 week. And then later on in a week, we'll just have like a digital catch-up, either via video call, via WhatsApp, just checking how everyone's doing. Whereas some youth groups I'm working with, where they don't really have that kind of infrastructure, activity just has stopped. And it might die, that youth group just might die out completely. And so I really do think that both in terms of the support for that, but also the agitation to community leaders to be adopting that, I think that is a big challenge, partly cultural, but as well, like, there are resource challenges in that as well.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Thank you, Froy. I think there was a question from Kirsten. Hey, don't know. I think it was kind of an interesting question in relation to. Are you there? Hi, Kirsten. Would you like to ask it yourself? I think it was very relevant to the question of choice, whether,
yeah,
it's a choice.
Sorry, it was a long one. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for your presentations. They're really lovely. Yeah, I would just wondered, because there's a lot of talk about sort of the innovations and the way that things are developing. And I was just wondering, because I work with a nonprofit here in the Northeast, and sort of in seeing how they've developed things and using their local community to like rapidly develop service responses to COVID's been really interesting and really great and really cool. But I was wondering, in kind of approaching these things as innovations, kind of looking at how for a lot of people, digital technology might not be the first choice, and they might not have gone into this excitedly or openly. And now kind of within research, how do we, as people working in these spaces and researching in these spaces, kind of approach these topics where, like, I feel like in one respect, not losing the context that in some cases, these changes and innovations are being made because of a lack of other resources or a lack of anything else that can be done. And how do we kind of situate that within our own approaches ethically to be responsible towards kind of sustainable changes, as well as sort of ethically, and sort of considering these things as they are, perhaps in context of what it means to be performing these services at all. Sorry, that's really broad.
No, thank you.
I guess I'll start with that, and then I'm sure the others people want to come in, but I think I think you're right that on the one hand there is this view that Pam painted, which is a lot of choice, there's a lot of new things happening that people can engage, which will work for some people in some situations, and that's to be celebrated. But for others, it doesn't work at all. There's a complete engaging online is difficult. It's intense. It's embarrassing for some people. It's awkward. It does all sorts of things that they don't want to do. And also for some, it's just not how they want to have an interaction. And for others, they just can't. And I think, therefore, one of the things that in this sort of fast-moving space that we need to ensure, and I guess this is a morality point from my own position as a researcher, I would say that you need to look at diversity and plurality and to work with people who are working in many different ways. Some of those digital, some of those I work with some groups that are trying to engage with the hard to reach groups by being physically present in a socially distanced way and just using their voices through shut doors as a way of keeping some kind of continuity going. Work a little bit with the hospital clowns in Norway who are experimenting with live streaming clowning, which is a completely new innovation in hospital clowning, and how that in very, very difficult situations in children with very challenging conditions, how that can be done and what you can do and what you can't do, how you're able to compensate, and again looking at so the whole spectrum. And I think one of the things that we need to do is be alive to all those different possibilities and not privilege one class of interaction over another and one means of engagement over another, and bring them all to the fore. That's I think that would be my opening position. But yeah, choice is a really loaded term. Thank you. I don't know if James or Froy or anybody else in the session has some views.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thinking on a similar line, so our local University of the Third Age is one of the things that they're planning on doing. Obviously, they believe they won't be meeting face to face like they usually do for a foreseeable future, given that they're all in the threat category group. One of the things they want to do is they want to start using online sessions, meeting online for all the different groups that they do. But there's a lot of concerns about what technology you use for that, what works best, what sort of issues members will have. So it's not just about teaching them how to use it, but as has been mentioned, whether their internet access is good enough, whether their hardware is good enough. And that's something that when our guardians were doing the Zoom sessions, that's something that really, really came through over and over again. Their anxieties over, right, what happens if my internet drops out? What happens if their internet drops out? What happens if the cameras are not working correctly? What do I do? What happens if I drop out or someone else drops out? What are the mechanics of all that? So yes, different choices are good in a way, but I guess there's infrastructure issues that I don't know. I don't know how you solve that. It's definitely something that needs to be taken into consideration. It's something that preys on people's minds. Not entirely sure what the answer is yet. In the next couple of weeks, we are going to be having sessions with members of that U3A to see what those meetings could look like, and whether they are fully online, which they probably will have to be to start off with, but how you can improve the interactions. One of the issues that they were having continuously was people speaking over one another, which isn't necessarily that big of an issue face to face, but obviously when you're on video conferencing software, it just messes up your audio completely, and it's something that was reported to be a big issue. So yeah, very interesting question, lots of things to think about.
Okay, thank you, James. I don't think anybody else wants to come in at this stage. I think we had, maybe we've got time for one more question. Andrew McNeil.
Yes, Clara. If you can hear me.
We can hear you, Vasily.
Yeah, perfect. So just a couple of thoughts on this matter of access during this time as well, just in case it helps the conversation. I guess what I've noticed with the kind of the communities that we were working with during this time is that when the technology was introduced as a way of like sorting out some of the difficulties of the lockdown, in a way, what we've seen was that you had to translate that application to the context in which that was used. So an example of that is that I had to write like a couple of pages of instructions of how you use Google Meet to actually do online classrooms, for example, right? Because we kind of assume ourselves the way that these tools can be used for online teaching, for example, but a Solidarity school that has never used Google Meet in the past, they needed to get a proper kind of, in a way, translation of that tool to their own needs, which is more than translation in terms of language. It's more like contextualization of what does this actually mean as a tool for for an educational context, right? And the other thing that we've seen, just in case it's useful for the conversation, is that for the tools that people were already using, like Facebook accounts and social media accounts to post information to their own members and these kind of things, you kind of see that how the lockdown and the social distancing made visible quite a lot of the social processes in place that in a way, mediate these kind of systems. So you assume that people, remember the passwords, and you assume that people have a kind of delegate access to their own members to access their accounts, etc., etc. But in a way, this lockdown actually brought to the forefront that these people actually use, notice boards to stick their passwords on, and people can share the password by, just looking at the notice board and these kind of things. So I guess it makes visible these kind of the social aspect of the socio-technical kind of process that these organizations have put in place to manage access. And these are the two big learnings of the lockdown for myself, at least, in relation to access and technology.
Great. Yes. Thank you, Vasily. Yeah, it's really interesting how obviously to use tools creatively, you need to sort of understand what do they mean for your own context. It's interesting, some of the people that we've spoken to from the third sector in the UK, they couldn't translate their services using digital, so they just didn't do that, and they didn't have capacity because to sort of redesign pretty much the service in order to make it meaningful in any way using digital technology. Well, thank you, Vasily. That was really interesting. I wonder if anybody would like to add anything or no. Okay. I have lost the question that I'd seen before. I think we've got another 5 minutes, so perhaps we'll just take the question that I'd seen before, and I think it was from Andrew McNeil. I hope you don't mind me calling you out if you're still online.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I was just thinking about what James was saying about his Cyber Guardians project, and I really enjoyed all those presentations, but thinking about the importance of not only democratization of access, but building resilience within our access to technologies. Because remember, it was a few weeks back, it was one Sunday morning when a lot of churches were trying to get online and suddenly Zoom wasn't working. And so a lot of people then had to pull the plug. And I think that just highlights the fragility of certain systems and the importance then of building resilience for groups, so that if something doesn't work, then they've got different options, and not just putting everything into one kind of technology like video conferencing, because there's a whole range of different ways that we can actually communicate and build networks. Sorry, that maybe wasn't very much of a question, but James, if you get any follow-up comments to that, far ahead.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, as a security person, I truly believe that it is important to not rely on one particular service for multiple things. I answered your question on the chat, but I'll mention it here as well. One of the things that we're trying to do, the reason why we chose Zoom was because they were particularly interested in Zoom because it was a technology, again, it was in the news as being not necessarily a secure service, but at the same time, there were lots of people, friends and family, who kept asking them to join on things because obviously it's a very popular service. So there were anxieties around that, and they wanted to find out more about it. But as with all the training that we do, we try and keep it as platform agnostic as possible, so that it is not necessarily that, you know, this is what you do specifically on Zoom or particular on this specific system in order to be secure, but rather these are more general behaviors that you can do regardless of whether you're an iOS or Android or Mac or Windows or whatever, that, you know, can keep you safe, that can help you be safe. So yeah, I agree with you. It's I think in order to be completely resilient, in order for good practice, we should not be relying on one specific service or one particular mode either. As you mentioned, maybe you need to have backup plans where if systems are down or if you can't meet in person or whatever is happening, there are other solutions that you can go with.
Okay, great. Anybody else would like to add some thoughts on that? Some disagreement, just to spice it up. Joking, obviously. Well, I'm not actually, but yeah. Okay. Okay, I think we're getting close to the end of the session because there is another lovely one coming in 5 minutes. So I think we are going to wrap up. I'd like to thank everyone for joining our lovely panelists, for sharing their experiences and thoughts and all the questions that you've raised, and I hope this was an interesting session for you all post-lunch. So, okay. I think I'm going to close here. And thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon. Do get in touch with us. I mean, the network, if anything, is trying to very much create these connections between actions on the ground and academic expertise and capacity to do so. So we are here, but otherwise we hope to see you soon. Thank you.